Holy Gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ, according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus said, in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens shall be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds, with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lessons. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about the day or the hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
I speak to you in the name of God who comes to God's people and sets them free. If I had a word of advice for the season of Advent, which we are on the crest of, if I had some wisdom to offer, I would tell you to buckle up. One of the things that happens in the season of Advent is that we should be jostled awake by the readings that we hear. We should be shaken a little bit by the words of Jesus and the prophets that call us to pay attention in a different way. And so I wonder if you can do this with me while you're sitting there, wherever you are. If you can imagine yourself strapping in, like putting on your safety belt. You can put it over your shoulders, you can put it over your lap. Imagine that you have to sit here and listen to something important that you might otherwise turn away from. Because what happens in Advent is often we are looking ahead to, what holiday are we looking ahead to? Christmas. Except Jesus tells us that we're not. Jesus always pointed to something beyond him. Something after him. Something that God was still doing that didn't end or even begin with Jesus becoming flesh. And so in this season of Advent, we talk about it being a season of preparation, but it is not necessarily us only looking for Christmas to come into our world. It is looking for an ultimate reconciliation of God and God's creation. It is looking ahead ultimately to all things being made right, all things being made new. The coming of God where everything will be made as God intended. The ultimate day. We call it Judgment Day because God will judge the good and the bad and the right and the wrong and will make all things new and clean and holy. And maybe you grew up in a tradition like I grew up in, or maybe you heard the same thing, that Judgment Day, while it is something that we are mindful of and thoughtful of, it's really not for us. I was always told that as a Christian, if you were quote-unquote saved, if you were quote-unquote a believer, that things would work out. Judgment Day is really about bad people getting their just desserts. About God punishing those who were evil. About hell and heaven. And this great dividing line. And as long as we had one toe over this line, Judgment Day was about somebody else. We could be spectators, if you would, watching God mete out justice, or at least our idea of what justice looks like. But Jesus never pointed to that as being what happens when God's reign is full in the world. Jesus has never told us that that is what that new place where God's kingdom is the rule of the day looks like. It looks very different than what maybe we would hope for if we live in this us and them, saved and unsaved mentality. Jesus tells us that God is reconciling all things to God, bringing all things back home. And that includes us. We can't easily write ourselves out of God's story just by recognizing that we have been blessed by God. We think we're writing ourselves into God's story, but we're really writing ourselves out of it if we think that God's judgment or God's reconciliation is only for somebody else. Listen again to what the prophets say. This is one of the things that I want you to buckle in for, to pay attention to. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down so that the mountains would quake at your presence. As when fire kindles brushwood and the fire causes water to boil. To make your name known to your adversaries so that the nations might tremble at your presence. When you did awesome deeds that we did not expect, you came down. The mountains quaked at your presence. From ages past, no one has heard. No ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you who works for those who wait for him. I'm going to repeat that one because I love it. No eye has seen any God besides you who works for those who wait for him. You meet those who gladly do right, those who remember you in your ways. But you were angry, and we sinned. Because you hid yourself, we transgressed. We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like filthy cloth. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. There is no one who calls on your name or attempts to take hold of you, for you have hidden your face from us, and have delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. Yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord, and do not remember iniquity forever. Now consider, we are all your people. And there's an echo of this also in the psalm, that refrain praying that lament of how long, O Lord? How long? Show us your face. Show us the light of your countenance. These are people who are crying for God to turn God's face to them, who feel a separation from God, who feel an absence from God. Do you feel that in the reading? Do you notice that? This cry that goes up and says, God, you have been absent for too long. Be with us now. These are people who are hurting, who are broken, who recognize that the only way for them to know God's presence is for a God to sit with them, to not be absent. They wonder where God's tears are at when they are the ones weeping. They wonder where God's justice is at when they are the ones who are oppressed. They wonder where God's healing is when they are the ones who are broken. They are crying for God to be present. They are trying not to allow themselves to be written out of God's story. And they recognize that when God comes to right everything, yes, smiting the adversaries, bringing home the wayward, is something that they hope for. But the reality of what they believe will happen is that God will be present with them in the pain of this life. Not just tomorrow or some event across the horizon, but today. They desire and they demand of God God's presence. Turn your face towards us. We long and we crave with our very beings to see. In Mark's gospel, when we hear Jesus talking about the return of God and the Son of Man coming in glory, it's interesting when you look at the whole story of Mark. Because for Mark, we don't get a resurrection account. We don't get stories of Jesus coming back and eating fish with the disciples. That's in other Gospels. For Mark, the coming of the Son of Man in glory is when God dies on the cross. And yes, is risen again. But when God participates fully in the human experience, that is God uniting all things together, knitting the brokenness of the world, turning upside down our values and our relationships between life and death, but also between love and hate, wealth and poverty, brokenness and well-being. The very act of God coming with us, coming alongside of us in our pain, in our emptiness, in our utter desolation, is God bringing God's sense of justice to our world. Where, like Mary will one day sing in a few weeks, that God will be lifting up the lowly through God's actions. That God will be feeding the hungry and sending away the full. That God will be upturning our sense of right and wrong because we ourselves are ungrounded and we can only find solid ground under our feet when we are in the presence of God. And that is why we anticipate for God to be made real among us. That is why we look for God to be present among us. That is why we participate in this world at all. Not to understand that we have something that the world does not, but to know that the only way to know God's presence is to be in the presence of God, who sits with us in our pain. Even every day as we are dying, even every day as friends die, even every day as we experience loss, even every day as we are hurt anew, or we recognize our loneliness. That is the only way to know that God is a God of any value for us. A God who is distant, a God that we have written ourselves out of the story of, is not a God that belongs to us. And that is not a God worth following, but one who comes among us and makes all things new. That is the God that we can follow, that we can stake our claim to. Because God has valued us enough to be present. Not just as a forthcoming thing that is beyond the horizon, but as something breaking out right now. Something being made new right now. And while we see that most clearly in the person of Jesus, and as Mark saw it in the actual life and death and resurrection of Jesus, we know it in the community that makes that real to us. Who sits with us when we're weeping? Those among us who walk with us when we're in trials. Those who lead us out to sit with our neighbors and to help those who need help. That is the presence of God made real. That is the judgment of God in the world, reconciling all things to God. And that is the mission of the church that we all share. To know God and to make God known.